Welcome to Murder Mile UK True Crime. This isn't a video, it's an audio experience. The only images you'll need for this episode are these. So close your eyes, open your mind, and savour the sounds of Murder Mile. Everybody loves a good villain, and by the 1960s, Jack the Stripper was synonymous as a sadistic serial killer of sex workers in West London. His first two victims, Elizabeth Figg and Gwynneth Rees, were listed as unofficial, as with Figg most likely murdered by a client, and Rees's impossible to determine owing to her decomposition, but thought by police to have died during a botched abortion. Like every killing listed as unofficial or official, they only come to the surface when it suits a theory. They died 4.5 years apart. They didn't know each other. They didn't solicit in the same area. Their injuries were inconsistent. Their individual suspects were ruled out and unconnected. Figg was dumped against a tree. Rees was buried in a rubbish tip. One was found after 5 hours, one after 40 days. And only one of these victims of Jack the Stripper was naked. Which is odd if that's his trademark. All that connected them were they were sex workers who died half a mile apart. With the press wholly disinterested, the detectives didn't think these two murders were linked. And yet you can't quell a rumour. Yet all that changed with Hannah Tailford and Irene Lockwood, the first two official killings by Jack the Stripper. As both women were found naked, possibly strangled and drugged, and dumped in the same stretch of the River Thames, 2 months and a few hundred yards apart. But were they murdered? Created in collaboration with the True Crime Enthusiast, across this joint 8-part series, Paul and I will rip apart 60 years worth of myths, lies, misinformation and conspiracies of one of London's greatest unsolved serial killings, to make you rethink what you know, or have been told, about Jack the Stripper. My name is Michael, I'm your tour guide, and this is Murder Mile. Episode 348, Undressing Jack the Stripper, Part B of D. So why did Jack the Stripper become fact when the evidence was so flaky? 3 reasons. We all love a good story. We hadn't had a good gripping series of killings since John Reginald Christie in 1953. And with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War, and the threat of global nuclear annihilation and the Profumo affair, we needed a distraction from the horrors of the world. But Jack the Stripper didn't begin in 1960s West London. In 1922, in the impoverished dwellings of Moorgate, 9 miles east of Chiswick, a sinister pervert got his thrills by luring children as young as 5 into dark passages and convincing them to get naked. He never touched or assaulted them. He just wanted them to strip. 25-year-old James Drew was convicted of 26 cases and sentenced to 21 months. So why haven't you heard of this Jack the Stripper? Because it was reported accurately, without sensationalism, and nobody died. So what about the other 1960s Jack the Stripper in California? The masked bandit who terrorized the night spots of San Diego, robbing the bars, and forcing any attractive redheads to undress. Auburn-haired barmaid Geraldine Stoner so took his fancy that 3 times in 4 weeks he robbed Tommy's bar, with the police noting, "I imagine she's getting a little bit tired of it." He was a robber, a rapist, he was real, and he was a mystery. And yet, even though this Jack the Stripper could conclusively be linked to his crimes, and he was named before the West London Jack the Stripper had even moved on to his second unofficial victim, as the story didn't ignite the tabloid headlines, it was forgotten. So what made the murders of Hannah Tailford and Irene Lockwood official Jack the Stripper killings? born on the 19th of August 1933 in Pontyland, Northumberland in the northeast of England. Hannah, known as Terry, was the youngest daughter of William and Anne Tailford, and like all 8 of the women who were known as the Hammersmith Nudes, her upbringing was abusive, troubled and lonely. In 1948, aged 15, as a troublemaker and a tearaway, convicted of stealing clothes for her boyfriend, she was sent to Borstal in South Shields, again in South Norwood and London, and Addiscombe in Surrey, 2 of which she absconded from. And although she tried to make an honest living as a waitress and a machinist, still in her teens, she was offered a job as a cleaner by an ex-army officer. But again, being used and abused by men, she was made to wear a French maid's outfit while performing lurid sex acts. Unsurprisingly, being broke, unloved and depressed, Hannah had 5 convictions for theft and 3 for prostitution. She solicited in Bayswater, Queensway and Notting Hill. And according to Detective Chief Inspector Ben Devinault, who headed up the inquiry into her death, she was prone to discard her clothing. Which could be why she was naked, although DCI Devinault never hid his dislike for Hannah. By the early 1960s, Hannah had mostly progressed from being a streetwalker who picks up clients in cars on the curbs, to attending sex parties in fashionable Eaton Square, hosted by a foreign diplomat. She appeared in pornographic films, possibly involving S&M and strangulation, and in her Victoria flat, police found cameras, lighting equipment and a diary, which Detective Chief Inspector John DeRose, who later headed up the hunt for the stripper, said,
"She had evidently been taking compromising pictures of her clients, with the idea of getting extra money from them."
Similar to Irene Lockwood. And although several of the Hammersmith Nudes had address books which were never found, in an era prior to the internet, mobile phones, and for many, even home phones, this was not uncommon. In 1956, aged 23, Hannah met Alan Lynch, known as Jock. They never married. They moved between bedsits. They argued, accrued debt, and although they had a daughter together named Linda, of the 3 other children she'd given birth to, 2 were formally adopted, and in 1959, one she sold for £20 in an advert in a newspaper to a couple in Staffordshire, which sums up the tragedy of her life. By the time of her death, she was 3 months pregnant. Hannah Tailford was said to be the first official murder by Jack the Stripper. But to accept her death as a serial killing means to discredit a wealth of eyewitness testimony from very credible sources. In the last 2 weeks of her life, Hannah was seen 4 times near Charing Cross by Arnold and Elizabeth Downton, who knew her and were friendly with her. They said,
2 days before she was found, she said she was fed up. She said she'd been roaming around all day and felt like committing suicide.
She was depressed, moody, unpredictable, and addicted to Drinamil, a barbiturate known as Purple Hearts used to treat anxiety, but it was withdrawn from use in 1978 as it frequently caused psychosis. 9 days before her body was found, on Friday the 24th of January 1964, Alan Lynch last saw her alive at their home on Thirlby Road in West Norwood. Hannah cooked dinner, and before she left at 9:30 p.m, Alan said she turned to their 2-year-old daughter Linda and said, "How would you like a new mummy?" It was odd, as she adored Linda, but he put it down to an unusual blip in her spiralling mood. And with Hannah not back by the next morning, being annoyed, he was heard to say,
"The cow's gone and left me with the kid."
He searched for her in pubs and clubs. He spoke to Thomas Trice, a 69-year-old man who had paid to take nude photos of Hannah, who told him that she was planning to marry someone called Don or Dennis. And in the peak of anger, Alan gave away all of her clothes and personal belongings. He then spent the next 3 days blind drunk. But she wasn't dead, only missing. Over those 9 days, several credible witnesses saw her. Between Saturday the 24th and Sunday the 30th, she was seen at several coffee stalls she regularly frequented in Pimlico, Charing Cross and Victoria. On Friday the 31st, Arnold and Elizabeth gave her 5 shillings and bought her a meal,
as she looked miserable and had been crying.
And just after midnight on Saturday the 1st of February, 36 hours before her body was found, Frederick Townsend, a window cleaner, saw her drinking coffee at a Charing Cross coffee stall and said,
"She was high as a kite."
And although being just 5'2" and slim-framed, this should have made her an easy target. Frederick said,
"I've seen her in a temper, and she can really handle herself."
With it being bitterly cold, Hannah wore a dark blue coat, a flame red blouse, a black cardigan and skirt, black court shoes, a light blue pixie hat, a black leather handbag, and wore a watch and a plain wedding band. Reports state that a coat matching hers was found by Waterloo Bridge, with another found wrapped around a police boat's propeller. And although no suicide note was found, this was not unusual. On Sunday the 2nd of February 1964, at around 1:15 p.m, 2 brothers, George and Douglas Capon, who were competitive rowers at the London Corinthians Sailing Club, half a mile east of Duke's Meadow, were bailing out a rescue launch on the foreshore near Hammersmith Bridge for the day's sailing. The water was icy cold, it was high tide, and among the driftwood, detritus, and even an old Christmas tree which had become trapped under the old pontoon,
we could see all of her body, except the head.
The autopsy was conducted by Dr. Donald Tear at Hammersmith Mortuary. Cause of death, owing to river water in her lungs, suggested she died by drowning. But with barbiturates in her system, it was uncertain to what extent she was alive when she entered the water. With no signs of assault or defensive wounds, except an unspecified bruise to her lower jaw, although swabs found semen in her vagina and her mouth, there was no evidence that she'd been raped. Her body was naked, except for her stockings, which crumpled around her ankles. But there were no marks to denote that she'd been stripped post-mortem, as blood often pools around the elasticated areas. And with no ring or watch marks, it's likely that these were removed before her death, suggesting suicide. Dr. Tear stated,
"It is rare for someone planning to commit suicide to eat a large meal beforehand."
But with witnesses confirming her depression and drug abuse, a deranged mental state was possible. But equally, there were details which made less sense. Several of her teeth were missing. She had a faint mark on her neck, possibly by a ligature, a 1.5-inch wound to the back of her right calf, and most bafflingly of all, her own knickers were found stuffed into her mouth. But was this a murder? It was unclear. It could have been a suicide. It could have been an accident while on drugs. She may have died of natural causes, having sex with a client who panicked and dumped her body. Or as the ever-insensitive DCI Ben Devenold, who headed up the investigation, told the inquest,
"Miss Tailford was a sexual pervert, known to have attended orgies."
So perhaps she died during sadomasochistic sex, hence the lack of rape, the knickers in her mouth, and her body dumped while she was barely alive. All nearby houses, clubs and houseboats were searched. A foreign diplomat who ran kinky parties was questioned. But with no witnesses to her death or her final last hours, the case came to a logical end. On the 24th of April 1964 at Hammersmith Coroner's Court, the first official victim of Jack the Stripper was listed as drowned. And with insufficient evidence for a murder, it was ruled an open verdict. Unlike Elizabeth Figg and Gwynneth Rees, there were no suspects to hint at foul play. No known pimps or punters, and although the actions of Alan Lynch, her partner, were strange, having given away her clothes before she was even dead, he volunteered a statement, was questioned, and ruled out as a suspect. And yet one simple action, initiated by him, may have been the catalyst to many of the murder myths. On Tuesday the 4th of February, 2 days after her body was found, during his questioning at Lavender Hill Police Station. Alan, who was distraught, denied knowing she was a sex worker, which makes sense, as just by admitting that could result in him being charged with living off immoral earnings. But he told detectives about her blue leather diary, a freebie given away by Jack Swift, the bookmakers, in which she kept the details of many of her male clients,
whose professional careers she could have ruined.
There was no proof she'd blackmailed anyone, no evidence that someone wanted her dead. There was only a possibility that she'd taken her life. But that July and August 1963, half a year before her death, she was a witness in a high-profile court case alongside one of the later Hammersmith nudes, and this ignited the press's interest, who sought to lay blame for her murder when it was anything but. So how did this unexplained death link to the second official victim, Irene Lockwood? It's already been established that the killer wasn't after a young petite brunette, as half of the 8 were in their early 20s and the rest were 30 or thereabouts. Tailford was a brunette, but Lockwood was dyed auburn. And although 7 of the 8 were 5 foot to 5'3", some wore heels, other wore flats, and having picked them up in his car, it's unlikely he got a ruler out and measured them. Like Gwynneth Rees, Hannah Tailford and Irene Lockwood were pregnant at the time of their deaths. And although death by illegal abortion was mooted, they were the last of the 8 who were pregnant. There were several tenuous reasons why it was assumed, but not proven, that the deaths of Tailford and Lockwood were linked, and therefore were murders. Both were sex workers who died 2 months and a few hundred yards apart. Both were found naked in the River Thames, with possible ligature marks. But what's baffling is, of the 8 so-called Hammersmith nudes, these are the only 2 bodies which were found in the River Thames, and yet both of them were open verdicts and listed as drownings. So if it wasn't a murder, how were these women stripped and strangled? Would a suicidal woman undress in the depths of the freezing winter and then jump into an icy river? Yes, if she was high on drugs, chronically depressed, and wanted to make sure that she died quickly. But one report did say that a coat similar to Hannah's had been wrapped around a police boat's propeller, and that she had a 1.5-inch wound to the back of her right calf,
possibly caused by a boat's propeller.
The River Thames looks calm and peaceful, but it's not. It's powerful and violent. With tidal ranges of 25 feet, currents that reach speeds of 14 miles an hour, and with the dark and silty waters beneath being thick with driftwood, sunken ships, old bridges, builders' rubble, and underwater obstacles from centuries of being a major port, the 40 or so bodies which every year are pulled out of the river rarely come out unscathed. Even bodies fished out of the calmer waters like the Grand Union Canal at Westbourne Park, 4 miles north of the River Thames, have perplexed the most experienced pathologist. In July 1942, the body of 43-year-old Lena Cunningham was found floating by the Wedlake Street footbridge. She'd been stripped naked, had ligature marks to her neck, odd bruises to her face and body, and thick cuts up her chest. Home Office pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the father of forensic science, ruled her death as willful murder, stating she'd been stabbed, stripped, and dumped in the canal. But a second post-mortem proved something very different. As a homeless drunk who slept in a bush, she choked on her own vomit, fell into the canal and drowned, and across the days that her body was submerged, the propellers of passing boats ripped the clothes from her body, causing cuts to her legs and her chest, ligatures to her neck, and the water's turbulence resulting in punch-like bruises to her face. Like Tailford and Lockwood. Both were heavy drinkers and users of Purple Hearts. None of the women were proven to have been sexually assaulted, even though, bafflingly, the police suggested that the bruises to their faces and necks may have been caused by forced oral sex. And although it doesn't explain why Hannah Tailford had knickers stuffed into her mouth, Dr. Donald Tier said he'd seen it before in a suicide.
Used to muffle her own screams.
But hey, this is Jack the Stripper, right? The cunning serial-killing genius. Maybe it was all part of his devious plan. To pay off the witnesses, to blame a slew of suspects, to never leave a fingerprint, to be seen by no one, and to fool hundreds of experienced detectives and pathologists over 7 years into believing that his first 4 murders looked like a failed sex attack, a botched abortion, and 2 drownings. Or maybe the press and the public had a lot more to do with this myth than a lone stripper. Born on the 29th of September 1938 in Walkeringham, Nottinghamshire, Irene Charlotte Lockwood was the illegitimate child of Minnie Lockwood. And like so many women who turned to sex work, her past was littered with stints in the care system, prison, along with abuse, assault, drugs, fear, and rarely any love. She moved to London in 1958 and lived in West Ealing. She had 5 convictions for soliciting, 2 for insulting behaviour, 1 for indecent behaviour, and frequented King's Cross, Camden and Bayswater. Like the others, her life was unremarkable, until 2 details piqued the press's interest, hinting at something sinister. Out of the flat at 16 Denby Road that Irene shared with her friend Maureen Gallagher, their pimps Simon and Ray forced them to work long hours satisfying unwashed clients, to feature in pornographic movies, to pay an extortionate rent, to always be in debt to them, to pickpocket their punters, and making both women a target, blackmailing their clients. As was suggested by Detective Chief Superintendent John DeRose, just like Hannah Tailford, Irene Lockwood
had evidently been making compromising pictures of her clients with the idea of getting extra money.
But neither of these women ran the scams. Just as Gwynneth Rees lived in fear of her pimps, Irene was forced to do degrading things, as her life was expendable and nothing more. If she didn't do as they ordered, she was beaten. If she argued, she was disfigured, making her money-making powers worthless. And if she tried to flee the controlling restraints of her violent pimp, she'd be disposed of. There was no love lost for a dead prostitute. This is where the press got interested in the case and started connecting the invisible dots. A close friend of Irene Lockwood was 22-year-old red-headed sex worker Vicky Pender, who on the 19th of March 1963, 1 year before Irene vanished, she was brutally murdered in her flat on Aldolphus Road in Finsbury Park. She was found in her bed, semi-clad and strangled, with severe head injuries. Vicky, real name Veronica Walsh, was forced to blackmail married men using sexually compromising photographs. And for this, she, and not her pimps, was murdered by her client, Colin Wealth Fisher, who was given a life sentence for a murder in December 1963, 4 months before Irene's death. After his conviction, Irene and Maureen lived in fear for their lives. Over the Easter weekend of 1964, they fled the bedsit. That Sunday, the 29th of March, Maureen slit her wrists in the ladies' toilet at Bayswater Tube Station, and with her friend alive but hospitalised, Irene kept a low profile. But as she had to earn money, she sold sex in the place she less frequently solicited. Chiswick, on the banks of the River Thames, half a mile and a few streets west from the bodies of Elizabeth Figg, Gwynneth Rees and Hannah Tailford. Last seen on Tuesday the 7th of April 1964 at 8 p.m. at the Windmill Pub on Chiswick High Road. Her body was found the next day during low tide, beached upon the mudflats of the Thames at Corney Reach, 300 yards south of Hannah Tailford's body and half a mile north of Elizabeth Figg and Gwynneth Rees. The autopsy by Home Office pathologist Dr. Donald Tier stated, She was naked, but with no marks where the blood had pooled. Her clothes had been removed before death or shortly afterwards. And with no hint of violence, assault was ruled out. With water in her lungs, it was clear that she had drowned. Like Hannah Tailford, with a 6 to 8 inch wound to her right breast, this had been caused by a propeller blade, which may have been why she was naked and had a faint ligature mark around her neck. And although semen was found in her vagina and around her mouth, with no cuts or bruises, her rape seemed unlikely. Identified by her fingerprints and tattoos, on the 8th of May 1964, an inquest at Ealing Coroner's Court decreed her cause of death as drowning, with Detective Inspector Frank Rich stating of this 4th murder by the serial killer Jack the Stripper,
"There was absolutely no suspicion of foul play."
With nothing to link any of the victims, no primary suspects arrested, and the press stating,
"Victim number 4 may be a suicide."
this was a closed case whose tortured myth was destined to be forgotten. Or it should have been, until a beehive of bullshit was kicked open by a sad and desperate man. Kenneth Archibald was a partially deaf caretaker at the Holland Park Tennis Club, who, to supplement his disability pension, was paid by Joe Cannon to let an illegal after-hours drinking den open at the club, which Irene Lockwood was said to frequent, as his business card was found in her flat. On the 27th of April 1964, 3 weeks after Irene's body was found, having been charged with stealing hearing aids, Kenny got drunk, and at Notting Hill Police Station, he confessed to her murder using the details of her last movements, which had been recounted in full in the press. The newspapers were in fever pitch as,
"The stripper killer has been caught."
But proven to be a pathological liar, he was acquitted. Archibald said outside of the Old Bailey,
"It was silly to let my imagination run riot."
And Joe Cannon said,
"Everybody knew that the miserable bastard was as innocent as a newborn babe."
But then again, it's not uncommon for anyone to twist these simple facts for the sake of fame, money, or attention. For centuries, people have believed in rippers and strippers, regardless of the evidence. But 62 years before Jack the Stripper, and 9 years after Jack the Ripper, a similar series of suspicious deaths on the River Thames took place over a few weeks at Woolwich, Rotherhithe and Bermondsey. On Thursday the 17th of June 1897, the Evening News wrote,
17 bodies found in the River Thames in 3 weeks. The largest number ever known to have been found in that period.
One was described as
late 20s, 5'4", a small and delicate brunette, who was perfectly naked except for a bangle. Her left jaw was broken, injuries which may have been caused by a propeller, and it is not a rare thing to discover bodies from which the clothing have been stripped by the action of the tide or ships.
With no proof of robbery, rape or murder, and suicide a possibility, the coroner listed her as drowned. Another small brunette was found nearby at Mark Brown's Wharf in Tower Bridge. Her body was less decomposed, fully clothed, and had all of her rings on her fingers. And by Temple Pier, the rotten body of a small brunette was found, not dissimilar to Hannah Tailford, trapped under a pontoon with a driftwood. She was naked except for her boots, and like Elizabeth Figg, her cause of death was unclear. One of the victims, a short brunette in their early 20s, was a man. His nose was smashed, his ears, eyes and several limbs were missing. He was naked, and the inquest ruled his death as drowning. But did the people in the press believe that a sadistic serial killer was on the loose? No. Why? The evidence. The same happened on the 29th of April 1921, when in Weybridge, a naked female body was found with her hands missing. Then 10 miles away in Twickenham, that very same day, a female nude was found in the River Crane, her skull smashed. Were they connected? No, as nothing linked them but the date and their nudity. On the 30th of September 1903, on London's embankment, the body of a female brunette was found naked except for her stockings and her shoes. But with her throat cut, her demise was ruled as a murder. All of these deaths have been forgotten. All were listed accurately as suicides, accidents or murders. No lazy journalist or bored detective attempted to link their tenuous details in the hope of making a name for themselves. And in the years following Jack the Ripper, the public was savvy to the press's lies. Yet Jack the Stripper was different. He was a myth, a lie and a conspiracy theory, but also a convenient distraction from the horrors of the 1960s. The strikes, the wars, the assassinations, and the risk of nuclear Armageddon. The first 2 killings were unofficial. The second 2 were listed as drownings. And with no suspects or evidence of a serial killer, Jack the Stripper only existed in the minds of the people and the press. But all that was about to change. Undressing Jack the Stripper continues next week with Part C, the 3rd part of my series, with the 1st and 2nd parts of Paul's series of the True Crime Enthusiast podcast out now.